Welcome to the Backyard Bounty Podcast from HeritageAcresMarket.com, where each week you'll be hearing inspiring stories and educational interviews with expert guests to help your hobby farm thrive. And now, here's your host, Nicole.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Backyard Bounty. I'm your host, Nicole, and today I'm joined by Gene Kritsky, who is a PhD entomologist working with periodical cicadas for over 45 years. And today we are going to talk about cicadas. So, Gene, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So, cicadas are kind of a hot topic right now. I think a lot of people are worried about this huge influx that we are, supposedly getting ready to have. So I would really love to talk to you about your history with cicadas and, kind of figure out what might be in store for us this year.
When you say my history, I assume you want how I got into cicadas as a group? Well, yes. It's a pretty serendipitous story. I was an undergraduate at Indiana University. My plan was to major in paleoanthropology. I was really interested in human evolution. Mm-hmm. And I asked the professor, Paul Jameson, who I still am in contact with periodically, how do we have two skulls? How do we know they're not the same, or male and female the others? And he talked about morphometrics and how these measurements and things. And he said, you got to take an entomology class because that's where they're doing a lot of that. I filed it away, never thought about it again until I went to register for classes. And I was a sophomore. And the way they do it at that time, this is way before the internet days, we had to go into this giant field house and collect computer cards and put them in a certain order in the cards or your schedule wouldn't work. And it turned out I was also done by lottery. The sophomores were the last of all the classes. And within the sophomores, the Ks were the last of all the sophomores. So I was the last of the last to register.
Oh, goodness.
And I walked up to the desk, the zoology table, and I said to the woman, I remember this because it's one of these things that a life-changing experience. I said, I need 5 hours. Do you have anything open? And she goes, I'm sorry, all I have is entomology in the lab. And I thought, well, Paul told me to take an entomology class. Why not? 2 weeks into the class, I knew I was going to be an entomologist. Frank Young was the professor, and I had never met a man like this. He was in his probably mid-50s, and he loved going into the office every day. You could tell this. He just thoroughly enjoyed his job. And my dad was in insurance. He worked in crop hail insurance, and he loved what he did. But, insurance, look at life insurance. It's like making a bet with this company. Sure. I'm betting I'm going to die this year, and they're saying, no, you're not. And so it was a great career for him because he was able to put a roof over our heads and afford me an education. But I've never met a man that was so enthusiastic about this. And Frank was the entomologist who was hired to replace Alfred C. Kinsey as the entomologist. Alfred C. Kinsey was a gall wasp specialist who eventually got caught up into, got really interested in sex and started the Kinsey Sex Institute.
Oh. Wow, that's a different transition.
There you go. And so Frank and his wife and Kinsey and his wife used to play cards together. They were in faculty meetings together. But Frank had this wonderful, infectious sense of humor. And so here we are in the second week of that class. And this is in the fall of 1972. I'm dating myself, but that's okay. And he starts talking about cicadas. And I thought, whoa, this is really cool. And I've always been interested in history, and by this time I was reading things on ancient history, on particularly Egyptology, and as well as things in science and evolution. And I realized, listening to what he was talking about, that the tools of history could be used to study periodical cicadas. And, in science we have the scientific method. Observation, hypothesis, experiment, theory, that step process. But in history, like journalism, it's a different process. You're evaluating sources. There's primary sources right from the person's mouth or in their own handwriting. Secondary sources, tertiary sources. You're evaluating the credibility of these individuals. And I bet I could apply historical research methods to get more information on cicadas. And so when I finished at Indiana, I went to Illinois for my PhD where I worked with Lewis Stannard. And I should point out, Frank Young was the periodical cicada specialist for the state of Indiana at the time. He was mapping them out for every brood, publishing on them regularly. And then I went to Illinois where I worked with Lou Stannard, Jr., who was a thrips specialist, but also was their periodical cicada specialist, wrote the Periodical Cicadas of Illinois. And while I was in Illinois, that wonderful library the University of Illinois has, I started taking time every once in a while to get more cicada records. And by the time I finished my PhD, I had just under 7,000 records.
Wow.
And that was what started all this. And then I discovered right after the Macintoshes came out in the late 80s, there was this computer program which was being used by land developers to look at demographic marketing about where to put golf courses. And it had a great mapping function, which I adapted to use with my cicadas. And now I had a process where I could take all this data and I could see all the compiled data for all the Route 10 emergences. Or I could do emergence from 1800, 1817, 1834, and go on and going on. And so it's like, now I'm watching these broods change before my eyes as I'm playing with this computer. And that's probably a little longer introduction you wanted, but it's how I got into cicadas.
So when you first heard about the cicadas, what was it about them that you found so fascinating?
Well, it was the link to history. The first mention of cicadas in the Western world historical records, they were known by the indigenous populations for centuries before that. But that was in 1634 when the second governor of Plymouth Colony wrote a little blurb in the history of the colony about these insects that stray from bigness to flies or bumblebees that came out of holes in the ground and made such a constant yelling sound as to deaf the hearers and all this. And that was kind of cool. This is several centuries ago, and that was the first time Westerners had encountered periodical cicadas. And that just resonated with me. And then you read the first time that Brood 10 was reported, and that was in 1715 in Philadelphia. And that's the language is rich, and they have a vernacular that's very different from ours. It's like a time capsule, and it's all tied into bugs. You can't beat that. It's got interesting writing, it's interesting history, and there are bugs involved. And so what's not to like?
Absolutely. So as a lay person, you keep referring to them as periodical cicadas. What does the term periodical refer to?
The term periodical separates them from the annual cicadas.
Okay.
One of the questions I get asked all the time is, we have cicadas every year. What's the big deal?
Right.
And that is true. Here in Ohio, we have 20 species and subspecies total of cicadas. We have 6 species of periodical cicadas. There are 2 life cycles, 17 and 13 years, and we've got one 13-year brood and several 17-year broods. But then we also have the annual cicadas. Annual cicadas come out usually in early July here in Ohio. They come out in very small numbers. So when you hear them going bzz, 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 bzz in the trees, you might walk into the tree and you'll look and you have trouble seeing them because their coloration is green, black, brown. They've got green or black eyes, and you can't see them because they're colored like camouflage. And they're up in the trees, and they're backlit because you're looking up into the sky. As I said, they come out in very small numbers, and they're with us until early October. On the other hand, the periodical cicadas come out in May and June. They've got red eyes, black bodies, and they have a totally different call. But unlike the annual cicadas, they come out in massive numbers, by the hundreds of thousands in a neighborhood to millions in cities and billions when you look at it statewide. So that's a very distinct difference. And I work I work exclusively on periodical cicadas. I don't work on the annual cicadas, and that's why I make that kind of distinction. Okay.
And that was actually one of my questions as well. Here in southern Colorado, we have some cicadas, and they're always the sign of summer for me. I love their little buzzing, and I'm always excited when we hear them.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of neat because you talk about southern Colorado, the petroglyph of the flute player, Mahu, is a cicada.
Oh, really?
So they're even part of our rich cultural mythologies and stories. And so it's an interesting group, the whole group of cicadas. My research, I've published solely on the periodical cicadas or their cultural impact.
So these periodical cicadas, you mentioned a 13 and a 17-year cycle. How does that cycle work, and where do they go, during that period of absence?
Let's take what's going to happen here in the U.S. and it started happening in a few places in late April, but usually it's early May. The cicada nymphs, the last stage, the 5th nymphal stage of these insects, emerge from holes in the ground, from tunnels in the ground, when the soil reaches a temperature of 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and usually right after a soaking rain. That's when the real numbers start to come out. And these insects crawl out of these holes. They find a vertical surface. They walk up this vertical surface. Those surfaces could be tree trunks, fences. I've seen them do this on tires, on blades of grass, on weeds, whatever. They climb up this vertical surface, lock their legs, their tarsal claws on their legs into that surface to get a good purchase of that substrate. And then all of a sudden, the back of that nymphal skin splits, and that split extends all the way to the head capsule. And the adult insect inside starts wriggling out. And it's this wonderful creamy white with red eyes and 2 black patches behind the head, and shrivel up little wings. It actually pulls out and is hanging nearly upside down, only being held in place by just the tension of that opening of the split on the back of the last nymphal skin or the last juvenile stage. They hang like that for like 20 minutes or so while their claws get hard enough that they can work with. Then they do a sit-up. They grab a hold of the head of this thing and they pull their abdomen out. And now they're free, but their wings are all shriveled up. So they got to start pumping fluid through their wings. The wings expand, and then they look like a typical cicada, except they're still white in color. They haven't completed the tanning and the sclerotization. Tanning is coloring, and sclerotization is the hardening, if you will. They occur at the same time. And so then they start turning black in color for the body. They keep the red eyes, and the legs turn orange, and the wing veins turn orange, and eventually you have what we see this I think, rather beautiful, striking insect that is sort of hanging there now looking like a typical cicada, but it's not yet ready to do its thing. So it climbs up to the top of a tree and waits 5 more days to complete the hardening and maturation process. And all of that occurred the first day they're out.
Wow.
That whole shedding of the skin and turning dark takes about 2.5 to 3 hours, depending on temperature. 5 days later, you'll start hearing isolated males calling. Individuals calls. 6 days later, even more. 7 to 8 days, you'll see you're sustaining chorusing. By a week or so, you'll see the trees will be screaming with these things. And that's when all these males gather in the trees. In ecologically, we'd call it a lek, L-E-K, but we tend to call it a chorusing center, where the males are all singing and females are attracted. They fly in. And when they're close to each other, the male call for the large species septendecim, I'll see if I get my whistler to work, but it calls like, and at the tail end, when the pitch drops, the female, who doesn't have a sound-making structure, she'll flick her wings. So,
interesting.
And if the male hears that, he turns and faces her. He sings again. She flicks her wings. They want to get close. They'll shift into a second call. It sounds like, and then eventually he'll start tapping her on the head with his foreleg, and mating ensues. And that can take several hours. After that's completed, the female starts laying her eggs in the, not necessarily that instant, but within the next couple of days, laying her eggs in the new growth, the terminal ends of tree branches. And she'll lay her 500 eggs in these little quarter-inch egg nests, 10 to 20 eggs each nest, until she runs out of her eggs or runs out of branches first as she flies a new branch. And then she continues laying until she runs out of eggs. And on average, she has just over 500 eggs.
Okay.
And then both the male and female die. And then 6 to 10 weeks later, the eggs hatch. The nymphs, the new little immature cicadas, and they're really cute when they're small. they wriggle their way out of this egg nest and then just plummet to the earth. They don't crawl down, they drop to the earth. Wow. And I think that's a defensive strategy. It's all distinctive, of course, because they're extremely vulnerable to ants and spiders and beetles. And as soon as they hit the ground, they hightail it to the dirt, run down a blade of grass or whatever, and get underneath that soil as fast as possible. I've watched this happen. It's almost like, whoa, they're gone. It's quite amazing. They feed on grass roots for the next few weeks, and then on New Year's Day, they are between 8 and 12 inches below the surface, sucking on a tree root. And that's where they'll be for the next 17 years. While under there, they'll shed their skin 4 times. They'll make more tunnels. They'll tunnel around. They'll turn over some soil. But they keep finding a root to suck on. And they feed on the xylem tissue, which is that tissue that brings water and minerals up to the canopy. And that's their life.
So do they typically cause harm to the tree?
Not at that stage. In fact, I'm looking out the windows of my library here at the house, and I've got several trees I'm looking at. And my wife and I are very fond of cicadas. They got me tenure. So you've got to be fond of these animals. And before we bought the house, I actually went out and looked for egg nests to make sure I had cicadas here.
Oh, that's great.
But to answer your question, you can't tell by looking at the trees if they have cicadas or if they are threatened or not. I mean, it'd be harmful to them if they hurt the trees, because the trees is how they're eating and subsisting. So there's enough down there to feed, but they're feeding on the water, and they're not sucking all the water or breaking the water column. So you really can't see at trees and look and see what's going on here. Unlike the emerald ash borer, which is killing the trees in Southwest Ohio, we're going to lose hundreds of thousands to probably even billions of trees over the state over the course of the next decade.
So then what purpose do the cicadas serve in the grand scheme of things in the ecosystem?
Well, they're uniquely adapted to life in the eastern deciduous forest. And, if we went out and could wipe out all the periodical cicadas, the trees would still be here. We wouldn't notice the difference. But what they do when they come out, and during their 17 years, It contributes a lot to the ecosystem of the eastern deciduous forest. For example, while they're underground for those 17 years, they're tunneling around, they're turning over soil down there. And some studies have suggested it's not as great as what the earthworms can do, but it is not insignificant. When they emerge from holes in the ground, and when they come out and they emerge in their 17th year, those holes persist, and it's like a natural aeration of the soil.
Sure.
And here in the Midwest, we've been having these summers where we'll have weeks on end without rain. The clay in the soil gets really hard. And so when you have a rain, it's probably a big downpour. And so it all runs off the surface, except where the cicada holes are. Some of that goes down and waters the trees. When the adults come out in big numbers, they are an opportunistic food pulse for all sorts of animals. Dogs, cats, raccoons, rodents, even squirrels eat them. And birds, the birds are crazy about these things. So that food pulse means that those animals that are consuming this extra food, their offspring are surviving in greater numbers, which is beneficial to those populations that might have been in decline for whatever reason in the past. But even, let's say, increasing the rodent population, that helps the owls and the other raptors. So it helps the food web of the deciduous forest. When the females lay their eggs in the trees, sometimes the vascular tissue in the ends of the branches gets torn apart and the leaves turn brown and wither. Sometimes the branch even breaks where the eggs were laid and sort of dangles there, and we call that flagging. It looks terrible. It looks like the trees have been hit by a bad hailstorm. But a paper published in 1869, I love this the title. The title was, "Out of evil cometh good." and this paper talked about how farmers, orchardists in Illinois and Missouri, were saying we were having a bumper crop this year, and they were kind of perplexed by it. And it turned out the year before, brood 10 had emerged, and all that oviposition was like a natural pruning, and it resulted in a heavier flower set the next year.
Sure.
And so that showed that it's not all detrimental. Now, they can kill very young trees at that stage. If you plant, let's say, a new tree that you had is 4 feet, not barely the thickness of a pencil, if they should find that inviting enough to lay their eggs in, they can kill a small tree like that, up to about 3 to 4, 5 feet maybe at most. But the mature trees, they can tolerate that pruning from the flagging. But we're not done yet. We have, after they do all this, they die. The adults die, and their carcasses collect at the base of trees, add a little bit of summer rain or some morning dew, and 90-degree temperatures you have here in the Midwest, and they rot. And boy, do they smell. But in that decay, those nutrients go down those holes, and there's a nutrient cache that forms around the trees, which is beneficial for the trees. That's beneficial for the cicadas. So they may not be a species like the beaver, for example, that can change the whole area by blocking off a stream and making a wetland or what have you. Cicadas, when they do come out, do have a lot of benefits. For example, as I mentioned, the emerald ash borer is causing a large kill-off in our ash trees. And as you drive along the interstates here, you can see all the dead ash trees. And it's creating these open pockets. Well, this year, because of the cicada egg laying, may allow for more maple fruits, the little winged fruits to form and be distributed. And that may help fill in those spaces. Indeed, we found a number of studies have found that in Ohio, we're seeing more maples coming into these open spaces. And so this will help that by having more maple fruit out there.
I always like learning how, creatures that we might find inconvenient or otherwise, how they fit into the grand scheme of things. I think it kind of helps maybe accept them, maybe not appreciate them, but accept their presence.
I agree. I know. I always say, what good do they do?
Sure.
Well, it's like, does everything? What are they doing? Well, of course, what their whole purpose? They're just trying to reproduce and keep the next generation going.
Right.
It's those activities that intersect with other species that create the food webs, that create the nutrient cycles that we have, the water cycle, calcium cycles. All those are part of all this whole thing, and that's how the cicadas contribute.
Mm-hmm. So, not having experienced this personally, it sounds like it could be quite disruptive for some folks. Is there any way to kind of either manage them or some suggestions on ways to coincide with them as best as possible?
First of all, you need to come out east either this year or you come out in 3 years from now when we have brood 13 in Illinois emerging along with brood 19. You got to plan for that.
I'm actually going to be in Illinois in about a month and a half.
Okay. Well, what part of Illinois?
It's just outside of Indianapolis towards Missouri. I'm going to be in Illinois. I'm going through Indianapolis.
Okay, cool.
Terre Haute, I believe is the
Terre Haute.
Thank you.
Yes. Terre Haute, and then you're going to be, okay. You need to get Cicada Safari, because when you do that, there very likely will be cicadas right after you cross the Indiana into the Illinois border. That's where they occur. There's a little bit of remnant of brood 10 in Illinois. Okay. And so Clark County, Douglas County, those are some very rich emergence zones that are there. And with Cicada Safari, you can go right down and look and see exactly what street they're on. So it's not exciting. Like, searching these, but to answer your question about how do people prepare? Some people are freaking out. So I've had calls from people, Cincinnati, saying, we're going to go on vacation. We want to go to Washington, D.C. When will the cicadas be done? I said, well, they'll be done at the end of June, but I should point out to you that they'll also be in Washington, D.C. So I changed their entire vacation plans in one sentence. But for people who are freaking out, what I've been encouraging them to do is to get my app, Cicada Safari, and go on your own Cicada Safari looking for periodical cicadas. So go outside at night when they're emerging and watch that transformation. It's like having a David Attenborough movie in your backyard live. It's just, it happens so slowly. It's like, if you blink, you're going to miss it. Mm-hmm. This takes 90 minutes for them to crawl out of the ground and go through that process where they're all white, but they look like a regular cicada. And if you've got kids, bring them out with you and watch this. And it's dark because it's at night. You got a flashlight. All your peripheral vision is gone. It's focused on what you're looking at. And that's the kind of thing that can instill an interest in natural history and science in kids. And who knows, you might have a future doctor in the family.
Absolutely. So during your research, what is some of the most fascinating or interesting things that you've learned or discovered along the way?
In a broad sense, is how much more there is to find and to learn about periodical cicadas. One example that I'm most proud of in my work on these was the discovery of a previously unrecognized brood of 13-year cicadas in Ohio and northern Kentucky. Now, that population of brood 22 has been here for a couple centuries, which is, and even longer. But no one recognized that they were 13-year cicadas. And that was because they came out simultaneously with other broods or close to it. So we thought when they came out in 1923, that was the same year brood 14 came out. And a 13-year form coming out with the 17-year form, that happens every 221 years for those two same broods. And so then 13 years later, in 1936, it came out the same with brood 10. So they all thought all these records were brood 10. Didn't think anything of it. Nobody was looking in 1953, so we don't have records for there. But they came out again in 70, and that's when we started. Again, in 1970, there was nobody was actually mapping thoroughly here in Southwest Ohio. So it just was missed. And in my case, I've had the luck to get to know, the major cicada researchers of the mid-20th century, people like I mentioned Frank Young and Lou Stannard, but Monty Lloyd was one of the great cicada researchers of his time. His colleague Henry Dybus at the Field Museum, Monty Lloyd is at the University of Chicago. Generally just nice people and wonderful people. Well, I was actually giving a lecture at a memorial symposium in honor of Monty Lloyd after he'd passed. And the next morning I got an email from someone in Falmouth, Kentucky saying, we've got periodical cicadas here. And they shouldn't have had any periodical cicadas. So this is before cell phones and before digital cameras. So I drove back and drove down to Falmouth, Kentucky, and they had periodical cicadas. No question about it. And they were singing. They were massive. It was just, this is just so strange. And I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. And then I remembered that in 1988, a year after brood 10, we had a lot of cicadas emerge. And it's common to have cicadas a year early or a year late. So that didn't bother me any. And in 1975, Monty Lloyd, the man who I was giving the lecture at his symposium, published a paper in the journal Evolution, periodical cicadas coming out after 18 years. It was all about what happened in 1975, coming out this population coming out after brood 14 emerged in 74. And I'm starting to do the math now. 74, 88, okay, 13 years. Or 75 to 13 years. 88 to 2001, 13 years. And that's not enough to drive it home to you. I want to find evidence of more in those locations at that time. So I decided also to drive to my study sites that I had set up for what I observed here in Cincinnati with all these cicadas coming out after brood 10 in 1988, and the cicadas were there. And then I started thinking, oh. So I started looking for evidence of their emergence in 1962, and I found it. It was in the building of the Melton Lock and Dam on the Ohio River, where they had to stop one of the people there that was involved said there were 2 days in 1962 that we had to shut down construction to get all the locusts off the reefs. And then I went back and checked, were they there in 1936? Yes. Were they there in 23? Yes. And then so therefore we have a 13-year brood in Southwest Ohio and Northern Kentucky. And I published it in my book, Periodical Cicadas, the Plague and the Puzzle, published by the Indiana Academy of Sciences. And some of my colleagues didn't believe me.
Oh, no.
And that's not, they were being mean. They're good scientists because this just doesn't make any sense. Brood 22 was known down in Louisiana and Mississippi, not in the Ohio River Valley. And so I felt, well, there's one way to show you. Let's just wait 13 years.
Sure.
And we did. And in 2014, they came out with a vengeance in large numbers. And so we were able to verify to everybody's satisfaction that we indeed had a 13-year brood here in Southwest Ohio and Northern Kentucky. And I'm very proud of that because it's not every day you get to discover a whole new population of periodical cicadas.
Yeah, that's very significant to discover something like that in your field. That's great.
The second thing that I'm extremely proud of happened as sort of a weird coincidence that led to a whole series of dominoes. It was 1991. I was teaching ecology, first week of classes, and I was also department chair. And I realized I had lab that afternoon. I had not planned a thing. And so it's the first week of class. So what do you always do in the first week of class? Scientific method. And so I gave him one of Monty Lloyd's a paper he wrote with his wife, Joanne White, who also was a cicada specialist at the time. And it talked about the difference between 13 and 17-year cicadas and how they grow underground. And I had the students read the paper, and I said, okay, if we were to dig up cicadas today, what stage of growth should they be in? And I had them write it on a piece of paper, and they put those in envelopes. They signed the seal after they sealed it up. And we went to the grounds crew. We got shovels, walked out to the university orchard to dig up cicadas. And they were bigger than they should have been. They'd molted once more when I was at the shot. And the paper said that if a 17-year cicada molts an extra time in the first 5 years, they'll come out 4 years early. So here at 1991, and I'm saying, well, your predictions are wrong, but if this paper is right, they'll come out in 9 years in the year 2000. Those kids, it's like telling people they're going to get cancer if they smoke. They just it's too far away.
Sure.
But every year from then, I was digging up cicadas, monitoring their growth. And in 1999, at the annual meeting of the Entomological Society of America, I presented a poster paper predicting that we were going to have an early emergence of periodical cicadas in the year 2000. And they came out. The first time anybody ever predicted an off-cycle emergence. And they came out in big numbers in some places. A woman called my, quote, cicada hotline. This is the answering machine days. And she said, why are all the cicadas in my backyard? And so I took a couple of my students who went to just to see what's going on there. And they were. The place was packed with cicadas, and they were screaming. That was something that's never happened. Usually when you have an off-cycle emergence, everything gets eaten by the predators. Not this time. They're singing. They were mating. They were laying eggs. That was the first time that we had documented essentially a self-reproducing off-cycle emerges. That was rather exciting. And I described that those initial works in the book I mentioned a few minutes ago. And then the question is, will they stay 13 years or they shift back to 17 years? That requires us to wait another 13 years.
Oh, goodness, I can't imagine.
You've got to be patient to work on cicadas. If I worked on fruit flies, I'd have this done in 3 months. But no. So we wait. And went out to the study sites in 2013, and cicadas were coming out by the tens and hundreds one evening, but not big enough to satiate and overwhelm the predators, which is part of the cicadas' life strategy. They basically have so many cicadas out there that the predators can eat all they want,
that makes sense.
And there's still millions left. In this case, they ate all they want. They ate them all. And not a single cicada was heard at any of the sites. I couldn't find a single adult. I collected hundreds of skins. And so that was interesting. So we have to wait 4 more years. What's going to happen in 2017? And they came out in incredible numbers in 2017. I think also joined by more brood 10 accelerated cicadas. And the result was that year I verified 33 locations in Southwest Ohio where they sang, they mated, they laid eggs, those eggs hatched. And so we have now actually witnessed before our eyes the origin of a new population of cicadas that will emerge during brood 6 years. And that's rather exciting. And for those things to happen like that, what did I need sophisticated equipment? No, I just needed to have patience and the observations. And that's what makes it sort of cool. You can make significant discoveries by, what is it? I know I probably get the quote wrong, but it was Yogi Berra that said you can see a lot by just observing. and that's basically it. You monitor what's going on. You have what's happening here, and you come back and check in 13 or 17 years. And that's those two things are probably some of the major contributions I made to the study of cicadas.
Well, that's definitely really exciting and obviously something to be quite proud of. Your Cicada Safari app, does that help you with your research as well?
Oh, that is something that I'm hoping to be is going to be extremely important. In fact, I'm very pleased that all of my colleagues that I worked with through the years and known, Chris Simon at University of Connecticut, John Clue, University of Connecticut, Mike Raup at University of Maryland, we've all been working on cicadas. And there's not that many of us, and when we get together, when broods come out, we usually end up in the same place, so we have a chance to have a fine libation of some kind and talk cicadas. They've all endorsed and embraced Cicada Safari to help us mapping. The Ohio Biological Survey, the Indian Academy of Sciences are also promoting this, as is my colleagues at the University of Tennessee, the University of Kentucky, the North Carolina Museum of Natural History, working with their naturalists. And so we originally developed this as a way of mapping out periodical cicadas. We've tested it twice now with brood 8 and brood 9. And case in point, brood 8, which is a small brood, we had 5,721 observations that we verified.
Wow. And
that was pretty nice. Last year, when brood 9 came out, we had just under 8,000 photos submitted. But what was exciting was not only did we get brood 9, we got evidence of 4 other broods emerging off cycle. And that's really wild. When cicadas came out, we would all gather where we expected them to be. We never thought about looking 500 miles east or west. There they were. And so we found all sorts of things. We had 13-year cicadas coming out after 9 years. We had 17-year cicadas coming out after 13 years. We had brood 10 coming out a year early. We had brood 5 coming out 4 years late. It was just wild. It was just amazing. The other thing we've done now with the Cicada Safari, in addition to taking photographs, our scouts, as we call them, can submit 10-second videos.
Oh.
And the videos have audio.
Sure.
And we can identify which species are screaming as the part of the mating process in those locations. And so the app is really easy. You basically, first of all, the app is free. Price is right. We don't trace what you're buying at Amazon, nor do we care what you look at for in Google. We're not looking at any of that. What we want you to do is, after you get the app and you're in an area where the cicadas may be, but even if you're not, go out and look, because we're getting reports now from places where we didn't expect them. Already this year. And so go out, take a picture, if it's now when you see them just coming out, photograph that. When the trees are screaming, send me a video of just a screaming tree with the calls in the background. And those, once approved by our team of parataxonomists, people trained to identify periodical cicadas, we have the date, the time, longitude, and latitude. And once approved, they go on a live map. So if you have Cicada Safari right now, you can open up the map that's on the app and zoom in on an area. And if you keep zooming, you'll actually see the photographs that were approved for that area. And I'm tickled to tell you that as of today, we have 87,000 downloads of Cicada Safari.
Wow.
And it's growing. We're adding 3,000 people a day are downloading the app. So it's really exciting. And we could get one of the most detailed maps of brood 10 that we've ever had.
Well, that would definitely be exciting, and it sounds like it would be really beneficial to your research as well.
Oh, it's definitely. And one of the things that is kind of crazy is that back in the 1890s and again in 1919, the USDA suggested that brood 10 was going to go into decline due to deforestation for agriculture and urbanization. And Frank Young was very interested in that topic, and so he verified by 1958 that some parts of Indiana were showing decline in their brood 10 populations. He and I worked together in 87, and together we mapped out brood 10. I mapped out brood 10 in Ohio, and we found evidence that decline was indeed happening. The northern half of Indiana has cicadas in very patchy distributions in the counties, not like they used to have throughout the whole county. And so with our help from all of our colleagues that have downloaded Cicada Safari, we can get a really good feeling for how dense are these. It's gonna, so we're quite excited to see what we're going to find out.
Yeah, well, hopefully you are able to get a lot of really great data from that app. And I know that you also have a book. I apologize, I don't have the full title, but the Brood 10 book.
Right. It's called Periodical Cicadas, the Brood 10 edition. It's published by the Ohio Biological Survey. And it's not only does it tell you a nice introduction to periodical cicadas, all the broods, and the unique things about Brood 10, it also includes a chapter on the history of all 18 prior emergences of Brood 10 going back to 1715. Some of the stories in there, for example, in 1902, Theodore Roosevelt gave a speech at Arlington National Cemetery. And here's a man who went out to North Dakota after his wife and mother died and bought an interest in a cattle ranch and learned to ride horses and herd cattle and talk over a herd of cattle and be heard. Mm-hmm. And the cicadas in 1902 almost drowned him out.
Oh, no.
And I think one of my favorite stories, of course, is in 1970, Bob Dylan got an honorary degree from Princeton University. And while he's at the ceremony, and he brought with him David Crosby, who was sitting in the front row with all the family and friends of the people getting degrees and laughing at Bob Dylan, who wouldn't even go get his Nobel Prize, but he got this honorary degree. In the background, the cicadas were singing. And he goes back home and writes a song about the cicada. I think the locust sang for me. Or the Day of the Locust, which is kind of neat. So, and he's not the only artist that saw the periodical cicadas got excited. Ogden Nash wrote a really interesting poem about cicadas as well.
How interesting. So do you also have kind of the other significant history of cicadas in there as well, as far as they're tied to like human history?
Yeah. Yes. I'll touch base. I'll say, like in the year 1800, Thomas Jefferson is becoming president of the United States. At that time, there's some interesting things. Like we have a wonderful article from the Indianapolis, a newspaper in Indianapolis. Back in 1902 or 1885, I think somewhere at that time, which is it's almost poetic the way it's written. It's just incredible. It describes the whole life cycle, especially the reproductive process of the cicadas. Originally published in the Louisville Courier, things like that. But also the scientists who were involved with this early work. Case in point, Per Kalm, who was essentially a disciple of Linnaeus's, came over in 1749 and he's witnessed the Brood 10 emergence that year and took cicadas back to Sweden. And that's why Carl Linnaeus named the first species Cicada septendecim. That was Linnaeus who named the first periodical cicada. How
interesting. So the Cicada Safari app, I assume that's available both for iPhones and Androids?
Yes, it is. The App Store on Apple or Google Play will have it.
And your Brood 10 book, where can we find that?
You can find that on Amazon. There is a bookstore, the Audubon Natural History Society in Chevy Chase in Washington, D.C. has copies, I believe, and there are also copies at other bookstores as well, mostly here in Cincinnati. But it came out so late that a lot of the major facilities that bookstores use to buy copies couldn't get their hands on it fast enough to get it out there. So there are 3 versions available on Amazon, a full-color version, which is rather, I think, I'm kind of entomologist, we're frugal. I thought that was kind of expensive. So there's also a black and white version of the same book, and then even very affordable $9.99 full color print duplicate of the Cicada on Kindle. Okay. And so it's available in those 3 price ranges. And you can also go to cicadasafari.org, which is the website that supports the app, but it also has activities for kids, how to fold an origami cicada, cicadas they can color, and how to interview your grandparents to find out what they remember from previous emergences.
Oh, exciting. So, of course, we'll put the links to all of those in the show notes so that people can find them easily. And Gene, thank you so much for your time. I didn't realize that cicadas could be so interesting and exciting, and I really enjoyed talking with you today, and I love your enthusiasm, and thank you so much for your time and your information.
Well, I appreciate being here. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Wonderful. I'm happy to hear that. And for those listening, thank you so much for joining me for another episode, and we'll see you again next week.
For a behind-the-scenes sneak peek, receive episode notifications, or leave a question or comment for the show, text the word podcast to 719-292-3207, or visit heritageacresmarket.com/podcast.